Alright, now we're going to switch gears. There's a lot of action between the Montreal Canadiens and their farm team, the Hamilton Bulldogs, this week. A lot of players going back and forth. And joining us now on the Habs360 hotline to help us get some more info on these players is Dan Kramer, who is a accredited reporter for the Bulldogs and senior Habs writer for AllHabs on AllHabs.net. Dan, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Thanks for having me on.
It's our pleasure. So let's start off and talking about a player that's going to be making his NHL debut this season for the Montreal Canadiens, Jared Tinordi. We want to get more information about him. So what can you tell us? You've seen him play a lot more than probably the regular Canadiens fan. What do you have to say about his play so far?
Sure, absolutely. So there was a lot of hype, of course, around Tinordi coming into the season. He had a great season last year for the London Knights and for Team USA at the World Juniors. So there was big expectations on his shoulders. It was a very young team at Hamilton, and even though he's very young, he was a captain in London. He was a leader on the American team. So he's a guy who had that kind of maturity and leadership around him coming into this new young defense in Hamilton. And you know what? He's been good in Hamilton. He hasn't had the easiest time adjusting. He's a big guy. He's 6'6". Those guys usually takes a little bit longer to develop on defense. He's actually a really good skater for his size, but he still has some mobility and positioning issues related to his size, and being only 20 years old, he's still got a lot of time to learn the game at this level. Don't expect from him to be a Zdeno Chara. Yes, he's 6'6", but he doesn't have Chara's game in any way, shape, or form. I wouldn't say he's Hal Gill, but he's closer to Hal Gill than he is to Zdeno Chara. Imagine a Hal Gill who can skate much better, who is a little bit tougher and a little bit more physical. Tinordi can drop the gloves even though it's not his strongest point. And a guy who's a great team guy, kind of like Gill. So that's sort of an overall high-level view of his game. However, he's nowhere near his full potential yet.
Hey, Dan, this is George. I want to ask you a question about a player that had a lot of promise but has fallen off the radar, and that's Louis LeBlanc. What's he up to these days?
So LeBlanc's had a very tough season in Hamilton. He started the season very slowly, and then he got hurt, obviously, really early, and it was a high ankle sprain, which is a kind of injury that sometimes takes players a really long time to come back from. Even when they're back in the lineup, they're not at 100%, and that was the case for LeBlanc. He was struggling with his skating, and then he got hot for a little while. He was putting up some points, and even when he wasn't scoring, he was playing well. And the past couple of weeks, his game has just really gone downhill again. So it's been a really tough season for him. You see the guy after games. He doesn't look happy. He doesn't look like he's enjoying himself this year. It's been very frustrating. We can hope that he'll work hard over the summer to fully rehab the injury he's had and come into training camp next fall ready to get his career back on track. It's only his second year as a pro. We forget that because he played so much time in Montreal last year. But he's a sophomore at the pro level. Sometimes it takes guys a little bit longer to adjust. So there's still hope for him. His career's not over. But it's been a very tough season for him.
And there's another player that we've seen for the Canadiens. He's played 3 games over here, Gabriel Dumont, who here seems to be very energetic. Looks like he's giving a lot of heart when he plays. He's played 52 games in Hamilton. How was he when he was down there? What can we expect, you think, from Dumont till the rest of the season?
So Dumont was by far Hamilton's best forward early in the season. Once Aaron Palusha and Blake Jeffrion went down with injuries, it was Dumont who took up their role offensively. And that maybe speaks more to the lack of scoring talent on the Bulldogs than to Dumont himself. Gabriel Dumont shouldn't be your first-line center in any league, so that's just not his game. But he was really good. He was scoring opportunistic goals. He's a guy who works hard every single shift. He doesn't take a shift off. He hits. He blocks shots. He's a little guy, and that's going to be a big knock against him in Montreal moving forward with the small core that they've now committed to for the next 2 years. So that's always going to be a challenge. But, he's a good skater. He's feisty. He has some offensive skill. He was leading the team in scoring when he was called up in Hamilton. He's already got his first NHL point in Montreal this season. So he's a guy who could be part of a longer-term picture on a third or fourth line, most likely a fourth line if you have a really strong contending team. But yeah, he's a guy who just never stops working. He's a guy you love to have around the team in the locker room. He's a good guy to talk to. He's just an overall hardworking, likable player.
Hi, Peter here. I'd like to ask you, we've been seeing here on the podcast that the Habs might need like a fourth line player who might fill like an enforcer type role. I see Zach Stortini, with the Bulldogs there, who has some NHL experience. And do you think he could be eventually like a player that the Habs could call up to fill up a role like that?
Right, so the first thing, and I'm sure you guys are aware of this, but just to clarify on Stortini, he's not actually under contract with Montreal currently. He's only on an AHL deal with the Hamilton Bulldogs. So if the Canadiens did want to pick him up at some point, they'd have to go through that process with him. So whether they will or not is a question. He started the season very, very poorly. He was one of the letdowns in the Bulldogs when they really needed to lean on their veterans for support. Again, after Palusha and Geoffrion went down, they lacked that kind of veteran presence. And a guy like Stortini is the kind of guy you would want to turn to. But he was very disappointing. He took a lot of poorly timed, bad, lazy penalties. His skating is an issue. He wasn't fighting nearly as much as the team probably wanted him to. His offense was practically nil. So he's not the guy we've seen in the NHL before. His career seems to really have taken a turn for the worse since his NHL days. That said, he has put his game together a little bit over the course of the season. He's getting more physical. He's making those hits that you were definitely hoping to see out of him. Still no real offense in his game, but he's at least less visible for the bad reasons on the ice. So if a team does become desperate for some toughness, I could see him getting a contract as we get towards the playoffs, but he's not that key enforcer looking for in Montreal right now.
And the Montreal Canadiens had called up earlier Craig Patterin, who eventually got sent back down to Hamilton. What do you think is that the Canadiens organization saw that they called up Patterin before they called up Tinordi?
So I was, for a couple weeks before the call-up, I was advocating that Patterin should be the first call-up on defense ahead of Beaulieu, Tinordi, or Saint-Denis, who are the other part of the top three in Hamilton. Patterin is older than Tinordi and Beaulieu. He's a college guy, so he's got 2 years on them. So he's a little more mature, a little more well-rounded in his game. He plays a good two-way game in Hamilton. He can play on the power play. He can play on the penalty kill. He can play in every situation. He was on the top pair with Nathan Beaulieu, playing anywhere from 23 to 30 minutes a night. They were getting huge ice time in every situation together. And he's just a dependable kind of guy. So he's a little better in his positioning than Tinordi at this point, a little more understanding of the game and when to jump into the rush and how to play it. He's had more time to develop, and that's kind of where he's at in his game. We saw in Montreal that maybe he's not quite NHL ready just yet. I know his last game was probably the toughest, and even though he only played about 6 minutes, he didn't look the greatest in some of his shifts. So maybe he's not quite NHL ready yet, but he does seem like a dependable kind of guy who will eventually fill at least a third pair role on an NHL team, just based on his solid overall game and his frame. He has 6'2" filled out frame, which the other guys lack at this point.
From what I see on the standings, the Bulldogs are most probably not going to make the playoffs this season in the AHL. Do you think the only motivation that these players have right now is to just try to impress the organization and hope for a call-up?
Absolutely, and we've talked to them after the games, and that's what they've pretty much all said for the past couple of weeks. It's unfortunate that things didn't quite work out in Hamilton this season. They've been in last place they're not in last place anymore, they're in second to last place now, I believe, in the overall AHL standings. But, they've been down there for most of the year. It's been a development season for a lot of guys. They're a very young team, one of the youngest in the league. And at this point, that's what they're all playing for. They're playing for, some of the guys are playing for contracts for next season, some of the guys are playing for call-ups. Some of the guys are continuing to work hard to try to develop their own games at this level, really still adjusting to the pro level. So that's kind of where they're at. Playoffs don't look realistic, but there's a lot of jobs potentially up for grabs on the Bulldogs or even in Montreal next year. So they're looking to impress the right people at this point.
So who's the next players that the Canadiens may call up if needed?
So for me, when Michael Ryder went down, and obviously they called up Mike Blunden, but for me, the guy that, if they wanted to replace Ryder's offense, the one who's been most impressive in Hamilton recently is Patrick Holland. So Holland is another guy who a lot of people were talking about coming into the season because of how many points he put up in the Western Hockey League last year, but he was playing with two overage guys who dominated the league in scoring. So a lot of he set the record in the WHL for most assists in a season, and a lot of that came from playing with such good players. And he started the season in Hamilton really hot. He was one of the first producing. Then he kind of went cold for a while, and the last 2-3 weeks now, he's been on the team's top line. He's one of the leading scorers the last couple of weeks. He's scoring goals. He's setting up plays. He's making really, really nice moves. He's very skilled with the puck that we didn't see for most of the season, and that's a sign of him gaining confidence at the pro level. He's trying to pull the same kind of dekes and moves he did in juniors now. He's successful more times than not. So he's a guy, he's not big, which is probably why they called up Blunden over him. Blunden's been very good too, but Holland's not a big guy, and I think he will get his shot eventually. Though he's a versatile guy. He plays the point on the power play in Hamilton, on the top power play unit, either with Nathan Beaulieu or Greg Patterin. And we spoke to him, and he says he feels he can play all 5 positions on the ice, either wing, either point, or center. He does take face-offs sometime as well. So he's a versatile guy, good guy to have in the system, skilled offensive player, and I could see him, if not this year, then next year, getting a look with Montreal.
Just one last question on my part. I'd like to get your thoughts on maybe Michael Bournival and the goaltender that they got from Tampa Bay, Tokarski.
Sure. So Bournival, at the start of the season, another guy who's had kind of an up and down year. It's been the case for a lot of these rookies in Hamilton, which is it's pretty normal. You come into the AHL, you get a lot of energy, you're excited, then suddenly you realize, well, this game's not as easy as you thought, so your game kind of goes downhill a little bit, and then eventually you learn how to succeed at the pro level and get better again. And so that's the case for like it was for Holland. It's the case for Bournival as well. He's a two-way guy, and that's how the coach was playing him at the start of the season. He was getting huge minutes. He was leading the team in ice time for forwards many nights early in the season. And then, the offense wasn't coming. His role got reduced. He was a healthy scratch for a few games even. And then all of a sudden, since he's been back in the lineup, he's been very good. He's been in the team's top 6, centering the top line on a lot of nights. His offense hasn't been that noticeable. He had one big game where he had a hat trick a couple weeks ago now. He was the team's leading scorer, or battling for the leading scorer after Gabriel Dumont got called up. Just kind of put a little asterisk next to that, since the leading scorer in Hamilton's averaging maybe not even 0.5 points per game, so not a very high scoring team. But he's a good all around player. He will not be anything more than a third line center in the NHL if he reaches that potential. But he's a two-way kind of guy. Kind of imagine like a Thomas Plekanec with less offense. That's kind of his game. He's gritty, he gets in your face, he gets under people's skin, but he's not quite got the offensive skills of some of the other guys. And then Tokarski's been really, really good since coming to Hamilton. This guy is actually a legitimate NHL goaltending prospect still, so I think it was a great trade to give up a guy in Cedric Desharnais, who's probably peaked at his career potential level at this point. Kind of like an AHL starter / potential NHL backup someday. Tokarski's a guy who's still on the rise. He won the Calder Cup last year. He had a bit of a tough time this year, but so did the whole team he was coming from a defensive perspective. And he's been nothing but stellar since joining the Bulldogs. His numbers have improved dramatically. He's struggling for ice time a little bit because Robert Meyer has been really good for Hamilton as well, so they're kind of pushing each other. But Tokarski's a guy who will be back next year with the organization, almost certainly. He's a guy who faces a ton of shots every night in Hamilton, whose defense has good nights and bad. And he's a guy who says the right things and has the right attitude. We've spoken to him several times after, facing 40 shots in a night and the team loses maybe 1-0 or 2-0 despite how many shots he's faced. And he's his own hardest critic. He'll come out and say, we'll talk to him, we'll say, you're happy with your game? You made 40 saves tonight. And he'll be one to say, no, you know what, I allowed one more goal than the other goalie, so I need to be better. I need to keep working on my game. I need to get those wins for my team. So he's got the attitude, he's got the skill set. I see a future for him with the organization if he sticks around.
Twitter handle is Dan Kramer, Habs, and you can read him on allhabs.net. Thank you very much for joining us, Dan.
Thanks a lot, guys. Appreciate it.